In 1905, a 24-year-old German immigrant with almost no money, no contacts, and no reputation arrived in London with a single obsession: to build a wristwatch that would never fail. His name was Hans Wilsdorf, and at the time, wristwatches were considered unreliable toys, fragile, inaccurate, and fit only for women. Men wore pocket watches. Serious men wore pocket watches. The idea that a tiny mechanism strapped to a wrist could keep precise time was, to most experts, a joke. Wilsdorf heard that joke every single day. He heard it from jewelers who refused to carry his products, from Swiss manufacturers who laughed at his orders, from newspaper columnists who mocked the concept of wrist-worn precision. And every single time, he wrote it down in a small notebook he carried in his coat pocket, not out of bitterness, out of determination. By 1926, he would prove every single one of them wrong in a way nobody had ever seen before, launching an era that would redefine what a watch could mean. Not just as a tool to measure time, but as a symbol of who you are and what you have conquered. Before we get to that legendary moment in 1926, I need to tell you about the 25 turning points that took a tiny two-person office in London and transformed it into the most recognized luxury brand on the planet. Number 25 will surprise you. Number 8 changed the entire watchmaking industry forever. And number 1 is the reason why, more than a century later, there are still people waiting years just to buy one. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because this is the kind of story that does not get taught in business school, and it absolutely should. Number 25. In 1903, before Rolex even existed, Hans Wilsdorf was working as a clerk at a watch importing company in La Chaux-de-Fonds, Switzerland. He was 22 years old, had lost both his parents by age 12, and had been raised partly by relatives and partly by sheer stubbornness. His job was to sort incoming shipments of watch movements and match them with the appropriate cases and dials. It was tedious, repetitive, underpaid work, and most young men would have been content to stay there, collect a modest salary, and disappear into the anonymity of commerce. Wilsdorf did something different. Every day during his lunch break, he would take apart watches that had been returned as defective and study each individual component under a magnifying glass. He was not a trained watchmaker. He had no formal technical education. But he had an obsession with understanding why things failed, and an even deeper obsession with understanding how they could be made not to fail. In 2 years at that company, he taught himself more about watch mechanics than most apprentices learned in 5 years of formal training. When he finally moved to London in 1905 and co-founded what would eventually become Rolex, he brought with him something no certificate could give. He knew exactly what was wrong with every watch being made, and he had specific, concrete ideas about how to fix it. Number 24. The name Rolex was invented by Wilsdorf himself in 1908, after years of selling watches under the brand name Wilsdorf and Davis. A perfectly respectable name, but one that, as Wilsdorf noted in his private correspondence, was impossible to say elegantly in any language. He wanted something short, easy to pronounce in French, German, English, and Spanish, something that sounded precise and mechanical, like the sound of a watch being wound. He considered hundreds of combinations of letters, filling pages with possibilities. The name Rolex, according to his own account, came to him almost suddenly. He described it as the sound of a watch movement in miniature, a word that was no word in any language, and therefore belonged to every language. Whether that origin story is perfectly accurate or slightly mythologized over the years is impossible to say with certainty. But what is undeniable is that the name worked. Short enough to fit on a dial, distinctive enough to be remembered, neutral enough to mean whatever the wearer wanted it to mean. It was one of the most consequential 4 seconds of naming in the history of consumer products. Number 23. In the early 1900s, the Swiss watch industry had a dirty secret. Most movements being exported to England and other markets were wildly inconsistent in quality. The same grade of movement, ordered in bulk, could vary by several minutes per day from one piece to the next. For pocket watches kept in a vest pocket with limited exposure to temperature changes and physical shock, this was manageable. For wristwatches, exposed to constant movement, temperature variation, and perspiration. It was catastrophic. Wilsdorf understood this problem before almost anyone else in the industry, and he made a decision that would define Rolex permanently. He would only sell watches that had been independently certified as accurate, not self-certified, not factory certified, independently certified by an official body. That commitment, made when the company was still tiny and every penny mattered, set a standard of accountability that the entire Swiss watch industry eventually had to follow. Number 22. By 1910, Rolex had achieved something no wristwatch had ever achieved before: a Swiss official chronometer certification from the Official Testing Bureau in Bienne, Switzerland. This was not a marketing certification. It was a brutal, unforgiving series of tests conducted over multiple days, measuring the watch's accuracy at different temperatures and in different positions. Pocket watches had received such certifications before. Wristwatches never had. The watchmaking establishment considered it self-evidently impossible. A wristwatch simply could not meet those standards given its size and the conditions of its use. Rolex not only met the standard, it exceeded it. The certification was not just a technical achievement. It was a direct, documented public humiliation of every expert who had said it could not be done. Wilsdorf made sure the news reached every jeweler, every industry publication, and every competitor in Europe. He was not modest about it. He believed correctly that this was a watershed moment, and he treated it as one. Number 21. Alfred Davis, Wilsdorf's brother-in-law and original business partner, was a crucial but often overlooked figure in early Rolex history. While Wilsdorf handled the technical side and the marketing vision, Davis handled the financial administration and the business relationships with suppliers. Without Davis, the early years of chronic cash flow problems, unpaid invoices, and precarious credit lines could have ended the company several times over. Davis was methodical, cautious, and deeply skeptical of risk, characteristics that frequently put him in direct conflict with Wilsdorf's aggressive expansion instincts. That tension was, paradoxically, exactly what the company needed. Wilsdorf's vision without Davis's restraint might have overextended the company fatally. Davis's caution without Wilsdorf's ambition would have produced a perfectly respectable small watch business that nobody remembers today. The friction between them was the engine that kept Rolex moving at exactly the right speed. Number 20. In 1914, the Kew Observatory in England, one of the most prestigious scientific testing institutions in the world, with a history of evaluating timepieces going back to the age of sea navigation, awarded a Rolex wristwatch a Class A certificate. This certificate had previously been given only to the finest marine chronometers, large, heavy precision instruments used for navigation on ships, designed and built by master craftsmen, costing extraordinary sums. To receive the same classification in a wristwatch was, by any measure, one of the most dramatic technical demonstrations in the history of horology. The Daily Mail covered it. Trade publications across Europe covered it. Even competitors who resented Wilsdorf's aggressive self-promotion could not dismiss what independent testing had confirmed. The wristwatch had arrived as a precision instrument, and Rolex had made it happen. If you have found this story interesting so far, leave a comment below telling me which number surprised you the most. We still have 19 more turning points to cover, and things are about to get significantly more dramatic. Number 19. World War I changed the wristwatch from a curiosity to a necessity. Officers in the trenches needed to synchronize attacks to the minute. And you cannot pull a pocket watch out of your coat while you are crawling through mud under artillery fire. Wristwatches became standard military equipment almost overnight, and suddenly the question was not whether wristwatches were legitimate instruments, but which ones were reliable enough to be trusted with your life. Rolex had spent a decade proving its watches could be trusted. When the market shifted, Rolex was already positioned exactly where it needed to be. The post-war civilian market, filled with men who had spent years relying on wristwatches in the most extreme conditions imaginable, came home with a permanent preference for wrist-worn timekeeping. The pocket watch never recovered. Rolex had anticipated a shift that most of the industry had ignored, until it was already happening. Number 18. In 1919, partly for tax reasons and partly because Wilsdorf had always found Switzerland more congenial to watchmaking than England. Rolex moved its headquarters from London to Geneva. The move was practically invisible to the public, but strategically enormous. Geneva gave Rolex access to the best movement manufacturers, the best craftsmen, and the most sophisticated watchmaking supply chain in the world. It also gave Rolex an address that carried an implicit stamp of legitimacy in the luxury market. In 1919, saying your watch came from Geneva was the equivalent of saying your champagne came from Champagne. The London address had been good for the English market. The Geneva address was good for the world. Subscribe to this channel if you want to understand how small decisions like a change of address can determine whether a company survives or becomes legendary. We are just getting started. Number 17. Throughout the early 1920s, Wilsdorf became obsessed with a problem that every watchmaker of the era considered fundamentally unsolvable: water and dust. Wristwatch movements of the era were enclosed in cases that were, in practice, permeable. Humidity from perspiration, dust from everyday environments, and moisture from rain or washing gradually infiltrated even well-made cases and damaged the movement. Jewelers accepted this as an inherent limitation of the product and advised customers to treat their watches with extraordinary care. Wilsdorf refused to accept it. He began working with a Parisian engineer named Paul Perregaux on a new case design that would seal the movement completely from the external environment. The concept itself was simple. The execution was almost impossibly difficult, given the manufacturing tolerances of the era. Wilsdorf funded the research personally, out of his own share of company profits, for years. Number 16. The collaboration with Perregaux produced, by 1925, a prototype case with a screw-down crown, a winding mechanism that, when locked, created a hermetic seal between the crown and the case. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a fundamental rethinking of how a watch case functioned. Every previous case had treated the crown as simply a mechanical interface for winding the movement. The new design treated the crown as part of the case's structural integrity, a sealing element as much as a functional one. The engineering required to make this work reliably at scale, across thousands of units, with the manufacturing technology available in the mid-1920s, was extraordinary. Wilsdorf and Perregaux spent the next year refining tolerances, testing seal integrity, and redesigning the gasket system multiple times before Wilsdorf was satisfied. Number 15. In 1926, Rolex filed for a patent on the oyster case, named after the oyster shell, one of nature's most effective natural sealing mechanisms. The name was Wilsdorf's personal choice, and it reflected his gift for communicating technical achievement through vivid, memorable imagery. An oyster protects its contents from the ocean. A Rolex oyster protects its movement from the world. The analogy was so clean, so intuitive, that it required no further explanation. This was not accidental. Wilsdorf had an almost journalistic instinct for framing. He understood that a technical achievement, however genuine, meant nothing if it could not be communicated quickly and memorably to a person standing in a jeweler's shop who had 30 seconds to make a decision. Number 14. The launch of the oyster in 1926 needed a demonstration. Wilsdorf knew that claiming his watch was waterproof was worthless without proof. The industry was full of exaggerated claims, and consumers had learned to be skeptical. He needed an independent, public, undeniable demonstration. He found it in Mercedes Gleitze, a 26-year-old English secretary who was attempting to become the first British woman to swim the English Channel. The crossing was more than 21 miles of cold, rough Atlantic water, and it would take Gleitze more than 10 hours. Wilsdorf arranged for her to wear an oyster around her neck during the attempt. On October 7, 1926, after more than 10 hours in the channel, Gleitze emerged from the water. The Rolex oyster around her neck was keeping perfect time. Number 13. Wilsdorf took out a full-page advertisement in the Daily Mail the day after Gleitze's crossing. It showed a photograph of her emerging from the channel, the watch visible around her neck, with copy that was, by the standards of 1926 advertising, almost shockingly direct. The watch had survived 10 hours in the English Channel in perfect working order. This was not abstract marketing. It was a public demonstration with an independent human witness, a specific duration, and a specific outcome. It was one of the first modern product endorsement campaigns in history, combining authentic human achievement with product performance demonstration in a way that created emotional resonance rather than simply listing features. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about the moments when ordinary decisions created extraordinary outcomes. Because we are approaching the turning points that made Rolex irreplaceable, and the story is about to get even better. Number 12. Through the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Rolex continued refining the oyster case while simultaneously pursuing a second obsession: eliminating the need to manually wind the watch. Manual winding required the user to turn the crown every day, a small but real inconvenience, and one that introduced another potential point of failure, since the act of winding exposed the crown seal to repeated mechanical stress. Wilsdorf believed the ideal watch was one that required nothing from its owner except to be worn. He funded development of an automatic winding mechanism, a rotor that converted the natural motion of the wearer's wrist into energy for the mainspring. This was not a new concept in watchmaking, but previous attempts had been unreliable and bulky, making it work within Rolex's standards of precision, and within the oyster case's sealed architecture, was a new engineering challenge entirely. Number 11. In 1931, Rolex introduced the perpetual rotor, a 360-degree self-winding mechanism that was more efficient, more reliable, and more compact than any previous automatic winding system. Combined with the oyster case, it created what Wilsdorf called the Oyster Perpetual, a watch that was waterproof, dustproof, and self-winding. It required nothing from the wearer except to live their life. This combination, hermetic sealing plus perpetual self-winding, was the technical foundation on which every serious Rolex watch is still built today, more than 90 years later. The perpetual rotor system, with modifications for improved efficiency and reliability, remains the core architecture of every automatic Rolex movement currently in production. Number 10. The 1930s brought a series of partnerships with explorers, aviators, and athletes that would permanently associate Rolex with human performance at the extreme edge of possibility. Sir Malcolm Campbell wore a Rolex when he broke the land speed record at Daytona Beach in 1935, reaching 276 miles per hour in his car Bluebird. The Rolex on his wrist was keeping time during an event so extreme that it produced forces capable of destroying most mechanical instruments. Campbell's testimony, unprompted and unsolicited, that the watch had performed flawlessly, became one of the most valuable endorsements in Rolex's history, precisely because it was not paid for. It was simply true. Number 9. In 1945, Rolex introduced the Datejust, the first watch to display the date in a window on the dial. This sounds trivial today, when every smartphone displays date, time, weather, and stock prices simultaneously. In 1945, it was a genuine technical achievement, requiring a mechanism to advance the date disc reliably and consistently at midnight, without disrupting the watch's timekeeping accuracy. The Datejust also introduced the fluted bezel, one of the most recognized visual elements in watch design, and the Jubilee bracelet, an interlocking 5-link design that combined visual elegance with wearable comfort. The Datejust was both a technical demonstration and a design statement. Rolex was not content to be the most reliable watchmaker. It intended to be the most elegant one as well. Number 8. In 1953, two events on the same calendar year established Rolex's position at the absolute summit of human achievement in a way that no marketing campaign could have manufactured. On May 29th, Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay reached the summit of Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, at an altitude of 29,032 feet, in temperatures of -40 degrees, in conditions that destroy most mechanical instruments within minutes. Hillary wore a Rolex Oyster Perpetual throughout the ascent and descent. The watch functioned without error. 4 months later, in September, a Rolex watch was aboard the bathyscaphe Trieste as it descended to 916 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea during deep-sea pressure testing. Ultimately the same vessel design, that would reach the bottom of the Mariana Trench in 1960 with a Rolex attached to its hull. Same year, the summit of the Earth and the floor of the ocean. Two environments at opposite extremes of human experience, both conquered with a Rolex keeping time. If you want to know which Rolex model from this era is considered the most important in the brand's history, comment below, and I will cover it in a dedicated video. Number 7. The Submariner was introduced in 1953, the same year as Everest, and it became the template for the modern sports watch. Designed for professional divers, it was rated to 100 meters of water resistance, featured a rotating bezel that divers could use to track elapsed time underwater, and was built with the rugged functionality that differentiated it from Rolex's dress watches while maintaining the same standards of mechanical excellence. The Submariner's design: clean, functional, bracelet integrated, with a dial optimized for readability in low light, influenced every sports watch designed in the following 7 decades. Many of the most respected watches from competing brands are, in design terms, responses to the Submariner. It is, by almost any measure, the most influential single watch design in the history of the industry. Number 6. In 1959, Rolex introduced the GMT Master, designed in collaboration with Pan American World Airways for their transatlantic pilots. Pan Am needed a watch that could display 2 time zones simultaneously. Pilots crossing the Atlantic needed to know local time and home base time without mental calculation. The GMT Master added a 4th hand, a 24-hour hand, and a rotating bezel calibrated to 24 hours, allowing the wearer to read 2 time zones at once. The design was so effective that it was adopted immediately by professional pilots worldwide. Decades later, when jet travel became accessible to business travelers who routinely crossed multiple time zones, the GMT Master became a status symbol for a specific kind of ambitious, mobile, globally engaged professional. It remains one of the most coveted watches in the world and commands extraordinary prices on the secondary market. Number 5. Hans Wilsdorf died in 1960 at age 79, having spent 55 years building one of the most powerful brand identities in the history of commerce. He never married a second time after his first wife Dorothy died in 1944, and he left his entire personal fortune to a charitable foundation, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, which became the sole owner of Rolex SA. This structure, unique among luxury conglomerates, made it impossible for Rolex to be acquired, taken public, or broken up. The foundation structure gave Rolex a permanence that no corporate ownership structure could guarantee. It also meant that all profits, rather than being distributed to shareholders or channeled into a parent conglomerate, were reinvested in the company and in charitable causes. Wilsdorf's final act of business strategy was ensuring that what he had built could never be dismantled by anyone who did not share his values. It was perhaps his most consequential decision of all. Number 4. The 1970s brought a crisis that nearly destroyed the Swiss watch industry entirely: the quartz revolution. Japanese manufacturers, led by Seiko, introduced battery-powered quartz movement watches that were more accurate, cheaper to produce, and required almost no maintenance compared to mechanical movements. Thousands of Swiss watchmakers went bankrupt. The mechanical watch, which had been the only serious option for timekeeping for centuries, was suddenly obsolete for purely utilitarian purposes. Rolex survived, but barely, and not without significant pain. The company's response was to double down on the values that quartz could never replicate: Swiss craftsmanship, mechanical complexity, physical permanence, and the status that came from wearing something rare and deliberately difficult to make. Rolex was not competing with quartz watches. It was competing with cheap cars, vacation homes, and business-class airline seats for the discretionary spending of successful people. It reframed its market completely, and in doing so survived a technological disruption that killed most of its peers. Number 3. The 1990s and early 2000s brought a paradox that no one in the watch industry had predicted: the explosion of digital technology, which made accurate timekeeping universally free via smartphones, made luxury mechanical watches more desirable, not less. When a $20 phone keeps better time than a $20,000 watch, The $20,000 watch ceases to be a functional object and becomes something else entirely. An object that expresses something about the person who wears it that cannot be expressed by the phone in their pocket. Rolex's brand, built over a century on the association with achievement, exploration, and excellence, was perfectly positioned for this transition. The watch was no longer a tool. It was a statement, and Rolex had been making that statement more convincingly than anyone else for longer than anyone else. The secondary market for Rolex watches exploded. Waiting lists appeared at authorized dealers. Certain models, particularly the Submariner Daytona and GMT Master, began trading on the secondary market at multiples of their retail price, a phenomenon almost without parallel in consumer goods outside of fine art. Number 2. In 2008, during the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, the luxury watch market collapsed. Every major watch brand saw sales plummet. Rolex did not publish sales figures. It never has. But industry analysts estimated a decline of 30 to 40% in unit sales in the worst months of the crisis. The response from Rolex's management, inheritors of Wilsdorf's foundation structure and his philosophy, was entirely consistent with how the company had always responded to difficulty. They maintained production standards, refused to discount, maintained their dealer relationships, and waited. They had no shareholders to answer to, no quarterly earnings calls to manage, no activist investors demanding short-term measures. The foundation structure that Wilsdorf had created in 1960 turned out to be perfectly designed for exactly this kind of crisis. By 2010, as the global economy began to recover, Rolex was in a stronger competitive position than it had been in 2007. Its competitors, many of whom had discounted aggressively during the crisis, spent years rebuilding the brand perception that discounting had damaged. And now we arrive at number 1, the single factor that, more than any patent, any product launch, any celebrity endorsement, or any marketing campaign, explains why Rolex occupies a category that no other watch brand has ever been able to fully enter. It is not the oyster case. It is not the perpetual rotor. It is not the Submariner, the Daytona, or the GMT Master. It is not even the genius of Hans Wilsdorf, though his genius was real and consequential. The single most important factor in the entire Rolex story is the one that takes the longest to build and the least time to destroy: trust. Not trust in the abstract marketing sense, not the word on a brand deck or a mission statement. Actual, earned, tested, publicly demonstrated trust. For 120 years, in every condition from the bottom of the ocean to the summit of the highest mountain on Earth, in every era from the trench warfare of World War I to the digital abstraction of the 21st century, in conditions of economic crisis, technological disruption, and cultural transformation, Rolex has kept a single promise: the watch will work. Not approximately, not most of the time, it will work. This promise was not made casually. It was made by a 24-year-old orphan in a 2-person office in London who had nothing to offer the world except an obsession with reliability and the stubbornness to prove it. Every subsequent decision in Rolex's history, the certifications, the patents, the Channel swimmer, the Everest expedition, the foundation structure, the refusal to discount, was a restatement of that original promise. Trust, once earned across generations, is not something a competitor can copy. It cannot be manufactured in a marketing budget or reverse engineered from a product teardown. It can only be built, slowly, over time, by doing exactly what you said you would do, every single time, for longer than most companies survive. That is what Rolex built. That is why there are people on waiting lists today. That is why the name on the dial still means what Hans Wilsdorf intended it to mean when he chose it on a train somewhere in Europe in 1908, listening to the sound of a watch being wound. There is a watch on your wrist right now, or there was one once, or there will be one someday. The question Wilsdorf spent his entire life answering is still the right question to ask about anything you build, anything you do, anything you put your name on. Does it work? Not does it look like it works. Not does it claim to work. Does it actually, reliably, demonstrably work? In conditions that no one made easy for you? In circumstances that no one guaranteed would be favorable? for longer than anyone thought was possible for something that small? If the answer is yes, then you understand what made Rolex. And if you understand what made Rolex, you understand something about excellence that no business school textbook has ever captured as cleanly as a watch face that is still keeping perfect time after 10 hours in the English Channel. Tell me in the comments, which of these 25 turning points surprised you most? And if you know someone who wears a Rolex, or someone who dreams of owning one, share this video with them. The story of how it got on their wrist is one of the greatest business stories ever told.